So I was quite surprised that our welder's combination tree pruner and pole saw actually worked. Now there were some things that were a little bit tricky to use, and of course I'll show you guys that, but overall it worked pretty damn well. And if you haven't seen one of these before, it's basically a really sharp saw blade and a pruning shear that's attached to the end of a really long and extendable pole, and it basically allows you to cut trees without using a ladder. Well, of course you could also use a ladder if you really wanted to get that much higher. So is this something worth buying? How high does it extend? How well does it work at full extension? How thick can it cut? And is it easy for anybody to use? Well, these are some of the questions I had. So of course, what did I do? I went out and bought one so that we can test it. Now there do seem to be a few different versions of this on the market. Some of them are cheaper, some of them are more expensive, but they all basically have the same functions. They've got a pruning shear, a saw blade, and an extendable pole handle. So I suppose it's just the way the cutting mechanism works and the build quality that varies. Now this one specifically has a 300mm or a 12-inch long curved saw blade for cutting and a bypass shear with a ratchet mechanism for pruning. And it can prune up to 25mm or 1-inch thick branches. Actually a little bit thicker, but we'll get to that later on in the video. And it's also got a fiberglass handle that extends from 1.65 meters to just over 3 meters, and the whole thing weighs only 2 kilograms, which is about 4.4 pounds. So after using both the saw and the pruner for a couple of hours, testing it out, this is what I think about it. Now you need to be pretty strong to use this thing at full extension, at or above shoulder height for any length of time, or maybe when you are sawing thick branches, or even when you are trying to accurately hook the pruner at full extension. The pole has got a fair amount of leverage, and when you're trying to control the cutting head that's almost 3.5 meters away from you, it can sometimes be a little bit tricky and a little bit tiring. And when pruning, you are also holding the pole in one hand and the rope in the other hand, so this can also get a little bit tiring after a while. So I guess let's have a look at how well the pruning shears work. Now you can see that the trees that I'm going to be cutting are pretty damn tall, and even with the handle at minimum height, it isn't long enough. But if I extend it near full extension, I can reach. Well, I say that with a pinch of salt, I can mostly reach. There were actually some sections that I still needed to climb on top of a ladder and use this telescopic pole, but that's a story for another day. And as expected, it cuts the thin tree limbs pretty easily, and you don't have to pull the string very hard. But something to note here, as the blade dulls over time, of course it will get a little bit more harder to pull, but a little bit more about this later in the video. Now trying to cut the thicker limbs at basically maximum capacity, now I think this one was around about 30mm diameter, that requires a lot more pulling force. And initially I was battling a little bit, and it felt like I was pulling a little bit too hard and that I would damage something. So I ended up stopping, and then the blade got stuck. And this is where you need to be careful not to forcefully twist the blade when it's stuck, but you kind of rather work it back and forth slowly until it comes out. So as you can see, I tried cutting through on a slightly thinner section. This one was around about 25mm in diameter, and it did actually cut through, but it needed a bit of a pull. But I did also notice when I was doing this that if you actually let off on the rope halfway through the cut, and then you let the ratchet kind of click onto the second and the third notch, the cut gets easy, or the pull gets easy once again. And I did eventually go back and cut that larger branch, and it was a bit of a pull, and it did feel like we were straining it, but I finally cut through it. You'll also notice that when pulling the rope at full extension, the fiberglass pole bends a little bit in the middle, but this didn't seem to cause any problems. So everything looking pretty good so far. A downside was that brand new and out of the box, the pruning blade was getting a little bit stuck when it was retracting. So like, what's up with that? This thing is brand new. And I found this to be actually very irritating and quite tiring to use, because kind of every time you made a cut, or every time after you made a cut, the blade wouldn't fully retract or open, and then you would kind of have to pull or bounce the string or the cord, and that would get the blade to then fully open so that you could sort of use it once again. It's almost like the return spring wasn't strong enough. Now to get around this, I just ended up loosening the blade's nut a really small amount, and this freed up the blade. Now this is not really an issue for me, but not everybody would know to do this. I'm kind of thinking that they're just expecting to buy something off the shelf and it should work. And it didn't even come with any instructions. So that was a little bit irritating. So as we can see, the pruner section here works quite well for soft and medium wood. Now the trees that I was cutting were mulberry trees, which I think are in the sort of medium category. They are pretty dense. I think you would battle a little bit if you're trying to cut dead hardwood, especially if it's a larger diameter. I think you may then be better suited to using an anvil type cutter or lobber. That said, let's have a look at how well the saw blade works. So here I'm going to start off with the pole at the shortest setting, and I'm going to try and cut through a thick branch. Now this one is about 110 millimeters. I think it's just over 4 inches. And I must say that the blade is super sharp on this thing and it cuts really easily. And of course, look, it is a brand new blade, so this is to be expected. But according to All Cut Power Products, which is the place or the store that I bought this from, they said it is a Japanese blade, the same as you get from Silky. And anybody that's heard of Silky before knows that those are really good blades. Now, I don't have any way to confirm this, so hopefully they are correct about the quality of the blade, and hopefully it stays sharp for a long time. The saw also works best when pulling, although it does still cut when pushing, but the blade tends to bend a little bit if it gets jammed. Now with this being at full extension and almost vertical, it's definitely more difficult to control and put pressure on the blade, so kind of start off with very slow and steady strokes to get the groove started. And you'll actually also notice that the blade jumps around a little bit, so it is a little bit tricky to control, but once the cut is established, once again, it cuts very well. I also found that the saw only works well for cutting branches that are well supported, pretty much like this one. It doesn't, however, work well for loose hanging branches that kind of bend and sway while you're trying to cut them. Now this branch is a little bit flimsy for the saw, but it's right at the limit of the pruner. So this scenario might be a little bit tricky if you need to cut something that is a little bit larger than this, and you need to cut the branch far out. And in this clip, I'm trying to cut using one hand at full extension. Now this definitely is not the way the tool is intended to be used, and it's not impossible, but it is pretty difficult. So once again, we can see that the saw blade works pretty well in soft and medium green wood, but I think you are definitely going to battle if you're trying to cut large diameter dead hardwood, especially if you are trying to cut at the full pole extension. Another thing that you want to be careful of, and we kind of saw this before, is that when you are pulling, like getting towards the end of the pull stroke and you're getting ready to push the blade back into the groove, the tip of the blade could get very close to slipping out if you're not careful. And if you get this caught up and you push really hard forward, you could end up kinking or bending the blade. And if this bends or kinks bad enough, then the blade is pretty much trash and you'll have to go and buy a new one. This one specifically is the Wesmart or Eco Garden brand, model number JP95-2234, and I paid 1,200 Rand for it. That's about $70 US. Now, I've never heard of this brand before, so one of my concerns was if spare blades were available. And Allcat said that both replacement saw blades and pruner blades are available. The saw blades are around 170 Rand each, and the pruner blades are around 145 Rand each. They also said that these blades can be resharpened around 2 times if that's something that you prefer. I was also told by the sales guy that because this has got a fiberglass pole, you won't get shocked if you by mistake cut into a live wire that's hidden in a tree. Now, I'm not actually going to go out and test this for obvious reasons, but some pole pruners have an aluminium or a steel pole. So if this is something that you're concerned about, it is maybe something that you want to take into consideration when picking out one of these. And now for a couple of things that I noticed with this specific unit. The head needs to be tightened to the fiberglass pole pretty tight so that it doesn't wobble. And I noticed that when you do this, it kind of squashes the fiberglass pole a little bit. And I wonder over time if this won't eventually crack or if it won't break just below the head. Now, I'm not sure if this will be an issue, but just to get around that, I ended up inserting a dowel, a 19mm dowel, because that's the inside diameter of the pole, so that once the head is clamped on, it clamps on really tight without deforming the pole. And occasionally when I was kind of twisting the handle when the head was a little bit caught up in the trees, the twist lock here would unlock itself and the extension handle would become loose. It didn't happen often, but it did happen. I also noticed that the rope did get a little bit tangled up sometimes. It was a little bit fiddly to use, but I think that is going to happen with any tool that you use like this that uses a rope on the end of an extension pole. And then lastly, the little plastic handle at the end of the rope. I didn't find myself using this very much, and I think it is adjustable up and down the rope, but I found it a lot more convenient to just take the rope, wrap it around my hand, and then pull as and when I need it. So would I go ahead and buy another version of this with a cheaper set of blades? And after having used this for a couple of hours, my answer is absolutely not. Preferably, you want to buy the best quality blades that you can afford, especially because you are cutting with this at such a far extension away from your body, so you can't really apply much pressure, especially when it comes to cutting with a saw. So the saw blade is actually having to do pretty much all of the work. So you want something that is really, really sharp and is very efficient at cutting. Now for occasional or maybe seasonal use, this combination of pole saw and tree pruner works pretty well so far. Although I guess only time is going to tell how well it's going to hold up and how long the blades are going to last. I think though, if you are using this on a more industrial or commercial sort of level, you're probably better off paying a little bit more to get a dedicated professional pole saw and a dedicated professional tree pruner. Although, as I said, do keep in mind, those dedicated professional tools are a lot more expensive. Guys, that is it. If you enjoyed the video and you found it useful, please give it a thumbs up. And please also let us know in the comments what you thought. Maybe you have been using these combination tree and pole saws for a long time and you've got some tips and tricks you want to share with us. Please do so in the comments because it is always, always great to hear from you guys. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.